Infinite Wealth. The game that aims to evolve on its mainline predecessor, to conclude Kiryu's 18-year-long story arc, and offer more content than any other Yakuza game before it is finally here. As you could have imagined, there's far more to this game than its sheer wealth of content, and the team pulled out all the stops in developing and promoting it, so the question that remains is, did they succeed? That is one of the core questions I aim to answer with this lengthy video. So whether you're a newcomer or a hardcore fan, I will do my best to show you Infinite Wealth for everything that it is. Thank you to the wonderful people at Guillotine and by extension RGG Studio for granting me a digital copy of the game, the importance of which will later become apparent. So without further ado, let's begin the analysis. First off, is this game really as big as the marketing made it out to be? To answer that question, I'll relate it to a different game that will likely be mentioned several more times in the video, the one and only Yakuza 5. For the longest time, Yakuza 5 largely reigned supreme as being the game that offered you the most content in the series, and while a number of titles succeeding it, for example Lost Judgment, were touted as being just as big as 5, if not even bigger, that never seemed to be the case in the end. And mind you, this is coming from a Yakuza completionist. With Infinite Wealth though, this is the first time that I can genuinely say a game has surpassed Yakuza 5 with its scope, and it did so by introducing so many new additions that we'll cover later on. Dondoko Island could be its own game. Hawaii alone is as big as Ijincho, and packed with a fittingly absurd amount of things to see. You have arcade ports of Sega classics we've never seen in the franchise, and the Big Swell DLC is basically its own mini-campaign. If you just clicked on this video to see if a longtime fan would still recommend the game, especially with how much the meme of reusing assets is being thrown around, then this should be your answer. By merit of new side content alone, this game is worth the base launch price, and this is without addressing the ridiculous boss fights and the combat. But therein lies an issue. See, if you've been around the community for a while, you remember how Yakuza 7 wasn't always as highly regarded as today. And one of the reasons for that was the switch to turn-based combat. This combat style has been stated to be a mainstay for the mainline games moving forward, which resulted in a fraction of fans stepping away from said games and sticking to spin-offs like Judgment. But why am I bringing this up here? Well, because the difference in combat approaches between 7 and Infinite is night and day. I've been very well on record as stating Yakuza 7 was the game that finally made me enjoy turn-based combat. With that in mind, I was in equal part curious and concerned about potential changes that Infinite Wealth could bring to its combat. What if it became too complex? What if it favored fans who were already acquainted with intricate turn-based strategies? Well, coming from a newbie to this genre, I couldn't believe just how comfortable the combat in Infinite really felt. It's not just that you can move around in combat, cause we've known about that for a while. It's that the actual fights feel like the perfect in-between of turn-based and beat-em-up philosophies. This time round, with regular attacks granting you a slight MP refill, it's a lot more viable to just brute force encounters, as it were. Not just that, but you have so many bonuses to the damage output exclusive to physical attacks. You can do combo attacks with a nearby party member, punch someone into the wall to increase the damage dealt, hitting someone while their back's turned will also do a similar thing. Hell, enemies will actually guard on occasion, meaning you'll be in the same situation as in Yakuza 3. You can either spam the exact same moves for minimal damage, or switch up your playstyle and experiment with your other tools. Even the various environmental objects like bikes and traffic cones are an actual offensive option here, rather than just being glorified window dressing like in Yakuza 7. What I'm trying to say here is that I didn't approach the combat encounters in Infinite as a turn-based affair. I approached them as if I were playing one of the older beat-em-up games. This is even further enforced by skills incorporating more and more button prompts, like mashing square and precise triangle presses. These were my favorite bits in 7's combat too, cause it felt like you were actively trying to bait out an opponent's attack, rather than feeling like you were playing a game of super chess. Just try booting up the Infinite Wealth demo from Gaiden and switching to Kiryu's rush style. Everything just feels so dynamic and exciting. And once you discover Dragon's resurgence, oh man. We even have an abundance of traditional QTEs in the boss fights, which is a godsend. But now for an equally important question. Does this make Yakuza 7's combat suddenly obsolete? Well, I wouldn't say that. It's true that Infinite stepped up its game massively, and once you go back to 7, it will feel like you're playing with one hand tied behind your back at times. But if you're watching this video, chances are that you've already beaten the game, and already have an overleveled party with which you can conquer New Game Plus. Essentially, Yakuza 7 in a post-Infinite Wealth world will now feel like a challenge run more than anything, as well as a place to pay homage to our fallen brethren head trauma, but it still is a fun experience. Anyway, back to the core topic, are there any classes that you should take note of? Honestly, I've spent most of my playthrough sticking to default jobs because they were so bloody effective. Heiress, Assassin, and Dragon of Dojima are at a perpetually shared number 1 spot for me. As for the even newer additions, Samurai and Kunoichi are perfect, even if you're just looking for something with an abundance of visual flair. As for which jobs have the best damage output, debuffs, and all of that, I'll need to get back to you once I max them all out. But for the time being, remember that you can carry over whatever moves you wish into any given job after fulfilling certain requirements. So if you want a job that's a true jack of all trades, it's all up to you and your dedication to further exploring the game. Next up, let's talk about the story. Something that's bound to be the most divisive thing about Infinite Wealth as a whole. I won't go too in depth on it here, because there should be a video released in the not too distant future which will go over very specific positives and negatives surrounding said topic. It will be in the top comment when the time comes, but back to the topic at hand, why is the story so divisive? Well, the brunt of your enjoyment here isn't going to come from some grandiose plot slowly unraveling, but rather from intriguing character interactions. Think of it like the approach in Yakuza 2 or Yakuza 5. You'll have many memorable exchanges, extremely flashy boss fights and bizarre set pieces, and you will have reached a point where those will be the focal point of the experience, even if they don't connect to one another as seamlessly as in the other games. This retroactively resulted in a number of people stating that nothing really happens in the story, and while I can see where they're coming from, you'll soon realize that Infinite wasn't trying to be just an average adventure. Considering Kiryu was brought back as a protagonist with the explicit purpose of being given a more conclusive finale, this game needed to act as a bridge that would allow for any loose threads to be connected, and let RGG fully step into a new generation that will feel unexpected to everyone, even to the most loyal fans of the franchise. So with that in mind, let's address another obvious question. Is this a happy or a sad story? Well, I'd say it's a happy one, or rather a hopeful one. Even though I've spent an exorbitant amount of time sobbing into nearby blankets, the ending of this game left me feeling complete. Once I rolled the credits, I just sat in front of my TV in silence, and it probably took me an hour to finally say, wow, this is it. It's literally the end of an era. Am I personally happier with this ending over the one in Yakuza 6? Not necessarily, but when you look at Infinite Wealth as a whole, especially with the bucket list, you can tell that this is much more of a worthwhile send-off to a legacy 18 years in the making. Now, earlier on, I did allude to the fact how the characters in Infinite are its most notable positive, and much like Yakuza 5 before it, this game introduced a considerable amount of them. So let's go over some of the most memorable ones. First off, Tomizawa. Initially, due to the whole betrayal arc, I wound up seeing him as an edgy take on Namba. It felt all over the place, and the reconciliation didn't feel as natural as I would have hoped. But then, you spend more and more time with him, and even without taking the drink links into account, you can tell that this guy has been overburdened for quite some time, something that wound up turning him into a complete wreck. But thanks to Ichiban's insistence on lending a helping hand, we get to see all of the positives to Tomizawa's character slowly unfold. He has a whole Majima vs Laogui moment, showing incredible restraint and personal growth when faced with the people who literally ruined his life. And before I knew it, as apprehensive as I was at first, I slowly started enjoying his company. But the moment that really sealed the deal for me was when this bloke saw an excavator and thought, "Don't worry guys, I have the perfect escape plan," then proceeding to destroy an entire theater. It was right there where I went, "You are nuts, and you're finally one of us, my boy." Chitose, on the other hand, is a fantastic addition because of how much of her screen time was dedicated to her playing a wildcard. Between robbing Ichiban, to her last-second decision to help him against the Barracuda, to showing genuine care for him in key moments, you never knew which side of her would be on display. Even past our reconciliations, it was still clear that she was hiding things from us once we reached the Palekana, making it feel like we had a ticking time bomb on our hands. This alone made every group conversation more entertaining, but when you add her cheeky nature to it all, she quickly became my favorite party member on Ichiban's side. And the redemption arc is also one of the most believable ones in the series, which should say something considering Like a Dragon's recent penchant to redeem everyone and everything. Long story short, Chitose is awesome. Technically, Songhee could also be seen as a new addition, considering how prominent she is in this particular narrative, but I feel like my adoration for this character has been evident for quite some time, so I'll just say, if you loved her in Yakuza 7, you'll love her even more here. Hell, that's a sentiment shared for most of the returning cast. Everyone from the old crew is as endearing as when we first met them, and seeing what they were all up to between these two games really felt like meeting up with some old friends in your hometown. Though I gotta say, I didn't expect all of them to return here, but I am eternally grateful that RGG went the extra mile and gave us even more chats to have with them at the bar. Now, what about the villains? Honestly, apart from the very last boss we fight, I actually adored all of them. Yamai is probably the most obvious MVP here, not just because of his iconic voice actor, but also because of how present he is. I remember some people saying how Yamai is to Ichiban what Majima was to Kiryu, but personally, I never saw it as such. If anything, it felt like he was an analog akin to what Kuze was to Kiryu, Saga was to Majima, and in certain ways, Takasugi was to Shinada. That is to say, he is an ever so present character you hate at first, but wind up adoring in the end, and the way he goes about it is uniquely his own. You're not gonna find another character like Yamai anytime soon. On the other hand, Dwight was another sight to behold, and how could he not be with Danny Trejo being his face model and voice actor? And honestly, even if you don't wind up clicking with one of the many antagonists here through the narrative alone, the boss fights will definitely make up for it, especially with the return of classic QTEs. All of the villainous groups in Infinite Wealth felt distinct, with the Barracuda having probably the most noteworthy and brutal introduction of them all. The only issue I really had with the villains, again not mentioning the final boss, was that it felt like the game couldn't justify every group's involvement in the overarching story. Between the Yamai Syndicate at first, the Barracuda, the Ganjo, the Seiryu clan, and the Palekana, we really could have done away without one of these groups, even if it cost us a memorable set piece, because the pacing of the story is strained enough as it is. Now that I've mentioned it, we might as well go over one of the bigger issues plaguing both the narrative and gameplay progression of Infinite Wealth. Let's talk about pacing. First off, it quickly becomes evident that this game is emulating two approaches to story progression, with the first half taking inspiration from Yakuza 7's structure, down to the introduction of 3 big groups in a new city, and the second half of the story trying to go the Yakuza 0 route. Both of these approaches are flawed in their own ways, and it's not because of what is present, but because of how it's presented here. The first half of the game shows an over-reliance on introducing the player to nearly every side activity in the game, which in theory isn't anything new for the series, but you would normally only be introduced to the major side activities during the critical path, for example cabaret management or the business minigames. In Infinite, on the other hand, You're introduced to anything, from crazy delivery, to Dondoko, to Sujimon battles, the list goes on and on and on. And while some of these detours are important, like introducing you to the job switching system, a number of them should have been left as optional side stories like they would normally be. Due to just how many tutorials there are, most of the first half of the story results in the party meandering around Hawaii until they coincidentally bump into the one person they need to slightly progress the story. And again, this wouldn't be an issue if it didn't repeat so frequently, because you obviously need to be introduced to a new environment. But with how beautiful Hawaii is, you wouldn't need to force people to interact with its content. They do it by themselves, meaning that all these detours do is hurt the story being told and results in unnecessarily prolonged replays down the line. The second half of the story has a similar issue, with how most of the Kiryu-centric chapters will largely focus on the bucket list, and once the story actually moves forward, you're then forced to switch back to Ichiban and have to build up the excitement from scratch all over again. We could have either eased up on the bucket list implementations in the main story, or had the protagonist switch happen every 2 chapters, like it did in Yakuza 0. But here, you switch after every chapter, and it always feels abrupt. Lastly, there's the issue of gameplay pacing as well, or rather, how the recommended levels function in this game. Now first off, major props for adding these recommendations before major long battles. They really helped out a ton. The way this relates to pacing though, is how the game always expects you to take a bit of time to grind additional levels all throughout the story. After going through a given chapter and reaching a point where you're warned about a recommended level, you'll notice how you'll be exactly 2 levels behind the recommendation. Ironically, the long battle after this will likely grant you exactly 2 levels of experience, but once you reach this warning in the next chapter, you'll once again notice that you are 2 levels behind where you need to be. Instead of having one major difficulty spike like in Yakuza 7's chapter 12, you're meant to grind a bit in every single chapter in Infinite, which wouldn't be an issue if you weren't bombarded with so many side activities at every corner, none of which will reward you with the appropriate EXP to hopefully alleviate some of the grind. I know someone will say, oh, but you can do all these fights underleveled, but let's not forget just how many chapters functionally regard these recommendations as necessities, like chapters 6, 10, and 12 among others. There's a number of bosses in this game that will keep regaining health, meaning that if you're not at the right level, you'll just have to deal with a painfully long fight and still have to grind in the next chapter. Now thankfully, these issues will be alleviated in subsequent playthroughs thanks to New Game Plus. Don't worry, we'll get there. But the reason why I'm bringing this up here is so that future games don't repeat these missteps. If you're going to introduce so much side content in the critical path, make sure to reward the player with enough XP so that they're not forced away from the main story for too long. A player's curiosity should be the thing that leads to exploring new side activities, not the critical path itself. Because with a game this long, I can imagine many people just getting tired of taking mandatory detours and eventually switching to a completely different game. They could wind up missing on a phenomenal story and conclusion, because the issue was never the content present, the issue was its placement. Alright, to lighten things up a bit, let's talk about the one thing that is always the subject of anticipation and extensive praise, the soundtrack. Let me remind you that the official tracklist for the Infinite Wealth OST includes 151 songs. In any other case, I'd say that quantity alone wouldn't be a guarantee that a release would be amazing. But this is RGG we're talking about, and you remember just how positive I was over Gaiden's OST and stylistic experimentation. As soon as Sega officially released the Infinite OST on YouTube, I went in for a deep dive, and I was caught completely off guard. What I was expecting was a largely electronic OST akin to the one in Yakuza 7, which I realize isn't everyone's cup of tea. But then on the flip side, we also wound up having an increased number of symphonic elements being front and center. The moment I heard the song Impregnable Triangle, I literally jumped from my table. This is a track that you would expect to hear in the finest Castlevania soundtracks, like Symphony of the Night or Dawn of Sorrow, and the context behind its use here is as perfect as you could have hoped for. In a similar way, the song called The Four might actually be my favorite tag team song of the franchise. Then of course, there's the beautiful use of a choir in the song Impersonation, basically giving the same goosebumps as Unwavering Belief did in Lost Judgment, if not even more due to the dramatic embellishments in the composition. Also, the song The End of Denial is one of the coolest boss themes to date, if we focus on the music alone. If you aren't into electronic music, you'll find an absurd amount of bangers here, and if you are into electronic music, I feel that a song like Barracuda should tell you everything you need to know about the quality of the songs on display. Looking at it as a whole, it's almost like the OST of Infinite is also emblematic of the duality between Ichiban's upbeat side activities and attitude versus Kiryu's somber and self-reflective demeanor. Here, it takes a form of distinct musical expressions that initially feel as polar opposites, but when observed in tandem, create a cohesive image of the experience. It is phenomenal. And now, let's move on to the topic of exploration. Can I just say that this is the prettiest RGG game that we ever had? I mean, really, I remember the whole conversation of the Dragon Engine supposedly showing its age and whatnot, but between this game and Gaiden, these are some of the most aesthetically pleasing vistas that I've seen in a while. Just looking at the sunset will leave you wanting to explore, and once you realize just how much Hawaii has to offer, you might actually find your new go-to comfort game here. Initially, it might actually feel like sensory overload, because of just how much you'll get to see, but you'll quickly notice that it's not as intimidating as you thought. Things like sub-stories and party chats focused on a specific party member will immediately stand out to you, and thanks to how you can literally travel to any taxi spot on the map, the distance between these points of interest won't really faze you. If you see an icon that is relatively unknown to you, or a brand new chain of convenience stores, looking at the map will give you more info on them than ever before, and you can even toggle between different groups of icons if it still feels like it's a bit too much to handle at times. Thanks to this game being a culmination of everything RGG learned in their quality of life improvements, even a map as big as Honolulu will feel as comfortable as Kamurocho in due time. Speaking of size, it looks like this map isn't nearly as big as it's been made out to be, cause it's actually comparable to Ijincho, but with more side activities being sprinkled throughout, and I think that was a good call. If this map literally was just Ijincho times 3, it would take away from one of the core philosophies that makes this series such a standout. The idea that you have a wealth of content expected from an open world game, but without the tedium of traversing a large, mostly dead environment. Hawaii genuinely justifies its size, and makes exploring it incredibly convenient. If you want to take your time exploring every street, you will actually be rewarded, due to the sheer amount of healing items, various collectibles, and NPCs you can befriend being found everywhere. There's a million other positives that I could add here, like the fact that you can reflect on party chats at Bar Revolve, that dungeons now have a spot where you can conveniently switch your jobs, the ability to one-shot severely underleveled enemies, the bingo card system, and the music player that also includes a smaller scale podcast filled with references to old Sega IPs. Frankly, I could describe each and every addition in this game and why they feel like the perfect culmination of everything I didn't realize I wanted out of Yakuza, but at the end of the day, I believe it's better for you to experience it yourselves. Literally the only negative I could think of when it comes to the exploration is how the Segway you can use has a limited battery life. That's it. And that's only because Lost Judgment gave us a skateboard, which is one of my favorite additions to date. Speaking of, the aspect of exploration even saw major improvements in the critical path. Back when Lost Judgment came about, I really wasn't a fan of the stealth segments. It's not that they were bad in concept, it's that their execution was too much of a departure from the core gameplay loop. Infinite Wealth decided to experiment as well, but this time using spatial hazards like lasers and poison contaminating a part of the level. While these may become troublesome in the speedrun setting, casually they're a perfect addition. because they don't stray too far away from your standard philosophy while exploring. Think back to the times where you got into a new part of the map where the enemies are way above your level, so you'd need to stop and go with accordance to their field of view to make sure you'd get through the area fairly unscathed. That's what this part of the Barracuda hideout felt like. You could, in theory, set off standard encounters right away, and then run away with the L1 button, but chances are that a higher level will also mean that the enemies get at least one good hit on you. Same with the lasers. You can blindly rush through, but it will quickly add up and drain you of your resources. I love this, and the fact that there are also swimming segments, implemented both in the critical path and side activities, means that the line between these two is getting blurred more and more. The end result is that this series feels far less like a stereotypical video game and more like something genuinely transformative and immersive, without having to tout about it in the marketing. The game speaks for itself, and that's the highest praise that you could give a work of art. And so, with all of that being addressed, it's time to talk about the side content, which is something that I've been dreading because where the hell do you even begin with this? I'll try my best to cover most of the new additions, because evidently things like gambling minigames, the UFO catcher, and similar activities have been mainstays of the series for quite a while, with very little differences between them. So instead, I'll do a very quick overview of each activity that caught my eye, starting with the arcade. The arcades in these games have always felt special to me, as I haven't had the pleasure of experiencing many classic Sega IPs when I was younger. And while I did adore editions like Super Hang-On and Space Harrier at first, I wanted to see what else made Sega such a dearly remembered name. In this game, we have 3 new additions to the lineup, in the form of Virtua Fighter 3 Team Battle, Spike Out, and Sega Bass Fishing. With regards to the first one, I already prefer it over Virtua Fighter 2, mainly because the AI feels a lot more fair to a newcomer. Looking at you, Dural. But just from a general standpoint, the mechanical jump between these two is amazing, and I might actually seek out the rest of the series because of this particular port. Spike Out quickly became one of my new favorite pastimes, maybe because I enjoyed the Tekken Force mode when I was younger, or that it reminds me of Kurohyou at times, or maybe because Minne's moveset in Yakuza 3 was apparently lifted from this very game. I realize that a modern gamer would say that this looks way too ancient, but you don't realize how quickly that preconceived notion fades once you actually start fighting through Spike Out. But then on the flip side, Sega Bass Fishing is an entry that I'm still trying to figure out. It's brimming with personality, but it will take a bit of time to get used to compared to the other two, where button mashing alone would still result in a really fun time. But here's the thing, I'm definitely going to come back to these minigames in the future, because Infinite Wealth did something that my platinum hunting heart genuinely adored. The platinum for this game doesn't require 100% completion. Like, can you imagine how long it would take to do all of this? Especially with this much side content? I think Yokoyama-san's warnings would have actually been extremely accurate in that case. So once again, thank you for omitting that little stipulation. Alright, time for the speed round. Crazy Delivery. Fun. Very, very, very fun. And once again, a beautiful homage to a Sega classic. Now all we're really missing is something related to Jet Set Radio, but it looks like Sega is way ahead of us on that front, so we'll just leave it at that. Mismatch. Imagine combining live chat from Yakuza 6 and the telephone club from Zero, and boom, this is it. I wasn't really big on these activities, but hey, if you think getting catfished by a chicken is fun, then this is the app for you. Sujimon Battle. Okay, so remember the clan creator activity from Yakuza 6? And how in Gaiden it went the full-on beat-em-up route? Well, imagine clan creator going further into the tactical route, and that's basically what you have here. Personally, not hugely into it, but I can easily see someone losing themselves in this side activity, especially if you grew up with a certain IP that may or may not have experienced this edition. Sicko Snap, i.e. an average tourist experience in the Balkans. No idea why it's here, nor will I inquire about it further. Dondoko Island. Okay, so, if you've been playing these games for a while, you'll notice how there's normally that one major side activity that got so much love that fans wind up wishing for a standalone game based on said activity. Dondoko Island is just that for Infinite Wealth. I really didn't think I'd enjoy it to such an astonishing extent, but I did, and so did many of my fellow Like a Dragon content creators. I go so far as to say that even if you don't care about Yakuza, but just think that this particular activity looks pretty cool, that you'd still get your proverbial bang for your buck from this minigame alone. I have no idea how long it takes to get a maxed out result, or to visit the islands of fellow players, but I'm immensely looking forward to finding out. I'm even contemplating how my island would look in the end, which might just wind up a collection of 1 trillion Tenkaichi Dore gates, so that the entire island looks like that one passage from Kenzan on repeat. And finally, everyone's favorite minigame, karaoke. This game's karaoke is one of the best in the series, bar none. Not only do you have literally the biggest number of songs out of any game so far, with basically every song from Yakuza 7 and the vast majority from Yakuza 6 and Kiwami 2 being present, but you even have alternate inputs and backup versions for each song depending on the bar and protagonist that you choose while singing your heart out. For those of us who have replayed these games for years and already know every interjection by heart, additions like this mean the world. And not only that, but we even have 5 brand new songs, all of which are brilliant. I've literally made a separate video just to praise the hell out of one of these additions, so by all means, listen to these songs, because regardless of your musical preferences, one of these is bound to be a perfect fit for you. As a slight addendum to this segment, before we move on to the next, I'll just briefly mention the dungeons in this game. Not counting the Big Swell, we have 2 dungeons at our disposal, which take shape based off the premise of predetermined RNG seeds. For a casual playthrough, these are amazing, because they alleviate the tedium of going through the exact same route over and over again while trying to level up. This way, you're actually paying attention as you open every single door. If I had to be nitpicky about it, I wish we had at least one dungeon with a set pattern that would serve as the optimal farming route, but that's mainly because I've enjoyed this game so much that I might actually max out every single job again, even though the platinum doesn't require it. With these activities out of the way, you may have noticed how something very important is missing from this script. And that's because the now well-known bucket list serves as a good segue to address a topic larger than side activities alone. That topic being fanservice. I remember seeing how some fans thought RGG has become way too self-referential in more recent entries, but let's be objective for a second. If there was one game in the series where being self-referential was not just a benefit to its execution, but a nigh necessity, it would have to be this one. If Infinite Wealth were to genuinely make up for any shortcomings that a game like Yakuza 6 may have had, in terms of loose narrative threads, it would have to go all out. And frankly, the way it was implemented into this game was genius. In lieu of Ichiban's personality traits that you could steadily level up, Kiryu has his own upgrade tree tied to the bucket list. The list itself has multiple layers to it, ranging from picturesque memories Kiryu reminisces upon, to more standard sub-stories/memoirs, to the so-called lifelinks. While I realize I gave a spoiler warning earlier in this video, I will refrain from showing any massive spoilers for this activity. Cause if you've been with the series for long enough, you'll know just how special it is, seeing a long-lost character finally be given a brief spotlight. And who better to tell you their stories than the man who has seen it all? Out of all the Like a Dragon console games released since 2005, the only games that didn't get some sort of nod to them were the Kurohyou games and Lost Paradise. Everything else, mainline or spin-off wise, is in some way accounted for, and that warms my heart. It feels like a no-brainer that Kiryu would have a stronger resolve to keep on living upon remembering all the people he had met, all the great memories he made and how much these people genuinely cared for him. Hell, if you happen to be someone who just jumped into this wonderful series because you thought this game looked amazing, but still had no idea about the story of Kiryu himself, maybe this side activity will give you an idea as to why this community is so profuse with their praise over it. These aren't just random images to us. We've seen all of this happen firsthand, making the bucket list possibly the greatest thing that this game has introduced. Which is saying something, considering how much I've been playing this game up to this point in the script. In fact, looking at the video right now, the only real criticism that I've had towards Infinite was largely tied to the pacing of the story and the nature of its difficulty increase. But if you're following games journalists covering this game closer to its launch, you've probably noticed a major point of contention that has yet to be addressed. Let's talk about the DLC. As I've said towards the beginning of this video, I was given a digital copy of this game, with said copy also including the most notable DLC packages tied to Infinite Wealth. And once I looked at everything it had to offer, I was shocked at how easily all the controversy surrounding it could have been avoided. Let's start off by stating the obvious. New Game Plus should never be sold separately on launch, and the same goes for the availability of basic difficulty levels. There's a number of people trying to excuse this business decision by stating no one cares about New Game Plus to begin with, which is not only blatantly untrue based on the community's reaction to the decision, but is also neglecting how the exclusion of New Game Plus in such a way actively damages the lasting experience. There are certain games in this franchise that are exceptionally notorious for being grindy, specifically Lost Paradise and both versions of Ishin. I frequently rank these games among my personal favorites though, because while the initial playthrough may be plagued by roadblocks left and right, the next playthrough shows you these games at their peak. Revisiting Yakuza games on New Game Plus, more than with any other franchise I'm a fan of, is a completely different experience, especially when you remember how the Dragon engine allows for immediate cutscene skipping in most recent entries. So remember all of the issues that I've mentioned with pacing and level ups? They will be negligible at worst and non-existent at best. Because again, New Game Plus is where these games operate at their absolute peak. And yet now, this option is being taken away, despite having been a mainstay for the vast majority of the franchise's lifespan. It reached a point to where longtime fans of the series have either refused to buy the game until it is dirt cheap, or have outright given up on it. C-level executives completely unrelated to the development team may not care about this, instead wanting to focus on enticing brand new consumers. But here's the thing, a casual consumer won't bother with an Ultimate Edition of a game on launch, especially on the current market, unless they've already had a pleasant experience with the series in question. The people who will actually buy this are established fans, ones who trust RGG for their unyielding creative drive and impeccable results thus far. So to whoever thought that this edition would be a great way to drive a short-term increase in revenue without considering the bigger picture, I'm telling you this as a person who's actually an economist by trade, this will wind up hurting everyone involved in the long run. If this game turns out to be an overwhelming commercial success, it won't be because of this DLC practice. It will be in spite of it. Because the marketing push was so extensive and the people contacted to promote Infinite were so profuse with their praise that this game could genuinely overcome the negativity that almost enveloped it. But a game like Infinite Wealth is one in a million, even for a team this talented. So the last thing you as established businessmen should want to do is endanger something that's still benefiting everyone involved at this point in time. And that's the tragedy of it all. If you take out New Game Plus from the DLC packs and have it be part of the main game, you're left with a DLC that is largely similar to what we've already had in the series since Yakuza 6. And if that were the case, I'd honestly be positive about the inclusions. Additional costumes, unique items for the minigames, the big swell as a whole, while you're not missing out on much by overlooking these from a casual consumer standpoint, for me and many others, these additions are amazing. They're giving us more oddities to enjoy in this fictional world that has kept our interest since the very first showing at the RGG Summit. Even if you're a trophy or achievement hunter, the DLC-specific additions aren't required to pop to platinum on any platform, which was yet another concern surrounding this release. But while I may have personally enjoyed the content involved, I can't in good conscience recommend that you support the DLC. I've said it once and I'll say it again. You can support a game without supporting its DLC practices. Don't let decisions out of RGG's control ruin a once-in-a-millennia experience, because everything that makes Infinite Wealth what it is, at its core, is beautiful and genuinely worth your time. So, final thoughts on the game. I love it. I may have my nitpicky grievances over some narrative tidbits and all that, but that's only because this series has set the bar exceptionally high. Plus, I've only played through the game once thus far, so I'm certain my outlook on it will evolve over time. Because rest assured, I will keep playing this game and revisiting it much like the rest of the series. If you just got back into gaming and you're wondering what to add to your collection, I'd say this is a fantastic choice. Then again, I may be biased considering my love for the series, but considering how this is also the first game in a while to break the IGN 7 out of 10 curse that plagued Like a Dragon, it might be more than just a fan's favorable viewpoint or a case of recency bias. We finally have a game that for the first time since Yakuza 0 seems to have genuinely clicked with everyone, casual fans and hardcore fans alike. So let's enjoy it while it lasts. Thank you for your time here, and I hope you got all that you wanted out of this video. I look forward to seeing you all again with even more content around this lovely series. So, until next time, take care of yourselves and have a great day. Cheers!